Thanks for tuning in to Ancient Greece, Declassified. Episode 8. Plato Strikes Back. What is justice? What is beauty? What is love? What is worth living for? What is worth dying for? And if you have an answer to any of these questions, how do you know you're right? Are these just matters of personal opinion? Or, as the X-Files tagline suggests, is the truth out there? And if so, do we have access to it? All these questions, and many more, were discussed by the ancient Athenian philosopher Plato. You might have heard the famous quote that all European philosophy is basically footnotes to Plato, because he raised all the big issues that philosophers have continued to wrestle with ever since. But who was this guy who dared to condemn future philosophers to footnote writing? In order to understand that, we need to back up a bit to where we left off in the last episode. After the Persian Wars, which ended in 479 BC, Athens emerged as the cultural and economic powerhouse of the Greek world for the next almost 80 years. What put an end to that golden age of Athenian democracy was a long and bitter conflict with Sparta, called the Peloponnesian War, which the Spartans finally won in 404 BC. One of the most interesting characters from this first long stretch of Athenian democracy, whose life spanned most of it, was a guy named Socrates. He was born 10 years after the Persian Wars in the new Athens that was still being built on top of the ashes of the old that the Persians had destroyed. And 70 years later, as an old man, he was tried and put to death by the Athenians, a few years after Athens lost the war to Sparta. Although neither rich nor powerful, Socrates made such a splash on the Athenian social scene that during his lifetime, playwrights included him as a character in their plays and lampooned him in front of the thousands of Athenians and foreigners who would fill the theater of Dionysus. During this time period, famous intellectuals from all over Greece would visit Athens, because Athens was the place to be, and none could avoid the inevitable run-in with Socrates, who was always hanging out in the public spaces, ready to debate with anybody who claimed to know something. And everywhere Socrates went, young men followed him, eager to hear his conversations with prominent citizens and foreigners, in which Socrates always claimed that he himself didn't know anything, and invariably proceeded to show that the person he was talking to didn't know anything either. So Socrates was a celebrity during his lifetime, but what has immortalized him in history are the writings of his students, because he never wrote anything down. But after his death, many of his friends and followers started writing dialogues featuring him having entertaining conversations with other famous figures from that prior golden age of Athenian democracy. And the most famous of these disciples, of course, is Plato. Plato's dialogues have survived almost perfectly intact, and most of them feature Socrates as the main character, although it's hard to know if the Socrates in the dialogues is a historically accurate depiction or Plato's invention. But it's pretty clear that Plato went above and beyond the philosophical investigations of his teacher, and tackled virtually all the big philosophical questions, using Socrates as his mouthpiece. And the ways of approaching these questions and the methods of answering them that he offered have been so influential that you can see Platonic influences in virtually all the Western religions and ideologies and philosophical movements and cultural movements in the past 2,000 years. But while Plato's dialogues have had such a profound impact, no philosopher since then has championed the dialogue format. There are a few exceptions here and there, but by and large, philosophers don't write dialogues anymore. Until now. One of the most respected philosophers today, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, has written a book called Plato at the Googleplex, which imagines Plato transported through time to the modern world and having philosophical debates with scientists, celebrities, and technology pioneers about important life questions. And the book is not just a series of fascinating conversations that show the enduring value of philosophy in the 21st century. It's also a complete crash course in ancient philosophy that tackles some of the big mysteries, like why was Socrates killed? What was Plato's relationship to Socrates? And why did philosophy emerge in Greece to begin with? Rebecca Newberger Goldstein is a prolific author and has received, among many other honors, a MacArthur Genius Award and a National Humanities Medal presented to her by President Obama in 2014. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome her to discuss Plato and Socrates and why philosophy won't go away. Rebecca Goldstein, welcome to Ancient Greece Declassified.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
Why don't philosophers write dialogues anymore?
It's hard. It's really hard. So I've had a lot of training because I moonlight as a novelist, and so I've had a lot of experience writing dialogue. But it's, it's just very hard to stay on the philosophical theme somehow and not sound, stilted and wooden and completely artificial. And, I'm not saying that I succeeded, but I thought, oh, well, all these decades of writing fiction have perhaps prepared me to attempt it.
So you have a special relationship with dialogues. Do you remember the first time that you ever read one of Plato's dialogues?
Yes, I do. It was one of the most dramatic moments of my life. I was a kid, and I was brought up very religious. People know this. I was brought up in a very strictly Orthodox Jewish household, and we were only pretty much allowed to read on the Sabbath. And so I was reading a book. I was 13, 14 maybe, reading a book called What is Philosophy by Will Durant. And I read the section on Plato, and it was my first experience with intellectual ecstasy. I just was out of my mind. I was breathless. I literally had to stop to catch my breath. There was just something about this idea of beyond all the mess of this world as this perfect world of eternal form, something like math. I was a math nerd as a kid. It just really excited me. And so the next visit to the library, I took out the Apology, and I loved it. The whole story of the martyr for reason just completely grabbed me, and I was off and running.
So the Apology is a slightly unusual dialogue,
yes,
because it's a defense speech, but it does include some dialogue bits, right?
Yes, right.
And when you encountered those dialogue parts, how did that format of the dialogue strike you? Did it seem like a natural way to do philosophy, or did it seem weird or strange?
Yeah, I didn't know enough about philosophy to know whether it was weird or natural. It seemed really natural because it seemed as if to argue philosophically was part and parcel of the way you lived your life, your whole life, and the way he had done philosophy, Socrates had determined his life and determined now his death, and he was standing by it. So of course I love the drama. I love I was also a future novelist, but that really seemed right to me. That philosophy was not just a job like other jobs, but it was trying to figure out how we ought to live our lives. And so it seemed natural to me, yes, that you would talk this way, and you talk to other people, and your entire life story would come out around these questions.
So it's not just a solitary activity, it's a team sport?
So much so. I mean, because one of the things, of course, about philosophy is that you are caught in your unquestioned, mindset, your ways of thinking that are so natural to you that you don't even see that they're there. And it depends on other people to challenge you. And, and I think that's why diversity is so important in philosophy as well. If it's just a bunch of, white men talking to other white men, there are certain assumptions that are not going to be noticed by them until they bring in some others. So I think, fortunately, they did make a lot of progress, those white men, but maybe it will be even more accelerated now that the conversation has been opened up to others whose personal history and so assumptions are very different.
Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, though, the scientists are saying don't even bother. I mean, people like Richard Feynman and more recently Stephen Hawking, have said that philosophy is no longer useful. The important questions have been taken over by science. So is your book, in part, picking up the gauntlet thrown down by these scientists?
Yeah, well, it is. And I have my whipping boy in the first chapter, a friend of mine. Most of my friends are scientists. I come from a scientific background. But Lawrence Krauss, who's a physicist and who has been very overt in his disdain for philosophy. But you know what's interesting? I mean, I want to get back to that, but what's so very interesting is that Plato is so defensive about philosophy that he, there in the very beginning, that he's shaping the discipline, and he is so concerned to defend it. I think it's in the Protagoras that he has this one brief passage that I think is utterly brilliant, where he is saying, if there's somebody who fancies himself a very good flautist and he, stands on the street corners playing the flute and he really is very bad, he has no musical talent whatsoever, his friends and his family will tell him, stop it, you're embarrassing us, you're embarrassing yourself, you can't play the flute. He'll be disappointed, but it's not going to completely devastate him. If you tell somebody, look, you don't know how to think about how to act, you don't know the difference between right and wrong, you don't know how to ground your beliefs, you don't know how to ground your actions, just sit down and let us philosophers do it for you, let us professionals do it for you. It's not like telling somebody they don't have musical talent. You are impugning their humanity, their very humanity. We are the creatures who try to ground our beliefs and our actions. And so for philosophers to say, hey, we're the experts on this thing, is antagonizing. And, I think that's part of the hostility that comes from the scientific quarter. They're very used to being the smartest guys in the classroom and, they know how to ground beliefs if anybody does. And I would say just, that they certainly know how to do science, and philosophy makes a big mistake when it tries to encroach on scientific grounds. But there are a lot of questions that are thrown up out of science and that are themselves just separate from science that the philosophers can make some progress with.
Yes, philosophers have always needed to be careful about not offending people, right? As Socrates did.
Yeah.
He paid the price for it.
Yeah, there's that precedent. There can be something quite dangerous about challenging the presuppositions of your society, to say the least. That's dangerous.
So of all of the great philosophers through history who you could have resurrected to be your champion in the face of these philosophy jurors, why choose Plato?
Why choose Plato?
Because you've written about many different historical periods.
Yes. Maybe I just wanted to write about the beginnings of it. I was trying to work out a theory as to why the ancient Greeks accomplished so much in such a short time. It's really, it's the story of the overachievers of all time. And, Bertrand Russell in the History of Western Philosophy, there's this passage in which he says, lists everything that they did, began, the empirical sciences and abstract mathematics and the study of history and philosophy and beginnings of, democracy and timeless art and poetry and drama. And he said, that for centuries all that we could do was just stare at them, amazed and mumble incoherently about the mysticism of genius or something like that. That's for sure. So I wanted to go at it, to immerse myself as deeply as I could in the culture that brought forth these thinkers that we've, that sort of really have propelled us forward. And not that they had all the answers.
So your character of Plato, who you bring to the modern world, he seems to adapt remarkably well to the modern world. He navigates modern situations very skillfully. Do you really think that someone from ancient Athens would be able to do that?
No, I don't. This is a very idealized character. I mean, I did imagine that Plato would be a quick study, right? Very, very smart man. but he's been with us all along, right? I mean, that was part of my thinking and sort of bringing him back. In some sense, he's been here. He has shaped our worldview to a large extent, or the questions that he's asked, the intellectual civilization, certainly the philosophical culture that came out of from Plato has been around here, so that there would be something familiar to him. That was partly what I was thinking. But I thought a lot about the character I wanted to give him. Again, because I also do novels, I think a lot about character, and dialogue has to come out of character. That's the secret to making it unforced and natural sounding. So I had this, really when I think about it, this incredibly audacious desire to give Plato a character. I don't know what Plato was like. Nobody knows what he was like. So partly I tried to give him what I think of as the best of philosophy, that he is avid for all knowledge, and he's open to changing his mind. Now, I don't know that was true. Well, I think it was true of Plato. He changes his mind quite a lot over the course of the dialogues. But in any case, I think that that's an aspect of the best of the philosophical mind, that you be willing to change your mind, that he's playful. I think philosophy is very playful, but also is very in touch with the tragic dimension of human life. And of course my Plato is as much a creation of me as Plato's Socrates was for him, right? Yeah. Someone I could love.
So one of Plato's first stops is the Google campus in Silicon Valley, and I guess one of the benefits of that is that he learns about the internet and he gets a nice laptop, and then for the rest of the book he has this laptop and he can quickly look things up and get up to speed.
Yes.
So what do you think Plato would have thought of the internet in itself, and also of our use of the internet?
Yes. So I first have him ecstatic. I mean, all of this, maybe not knowledge, and maybe he wouldn't call it knowledge, he certainly wouldn't call it wisdom, but information, that is so accessible. Later on in the book, he begins to become a little more skeptical and worried about our new toys, and worrying whether or not we're closing our minds off to challenges, to our own opinions. We've all sort of retreated into our own chat rooms and are only talking to people who agree with us. And so if anything, it's perhaps even closed off open dialogue, and or in any case, that's what I worry about, and that's what I have my Plato start worrying about. He's quite impressed with American democracy, though. Of course he would have given it democracy no time at all before it destroyed itself and was taken over by tyranny. Of course I wrote the book in 2014 maybe, and we've yet to see whether Plato's prediction for our democracy was overly pessimistic or not.
So Plato was writing at a time when the greatest democratic experiment up to that point had met with disastrous failure.
Yes.
And I guess in our modern world, democracy is new enough that it's doing very well. I mean, it has been doing quite well, yes. But we've never really seen a catastrophe hit a democracy in the modern world, have we?
No. I mean, there was the Weimar Republic that but a well-entrenched democracy, and there's not another better entrenched than the U.S. or Great Britain. And recently there have been surprises, and we'll see what happens. As you well know, the founders, who were all classically trained, I mean, that's what it was to be an educated person in those days, was to be classically trained. They had studied their Plato and knew what he saw as the flaws in Athenian democracy, and they did try to address those flaws. And we'll see whether our institutions can stand up, because there are certainly tyrannical or autocratic forces at work right now.
So now that we're getting into the historical picture here, so your book alternates between chapters depicting Plato navigating the modern world and chapters where you tell in your own voice the history behind a lot of the important developments in philosophy. So let's get into some of the historical stuff you talk about. One interesting point that you raise early on is that the emergence of philosophy in Greece in the couple of centuries before Plato is actually part of a much broader story that's going on from the Mediterranean to India and all the way to China. So what is happening at this time across Eurasia?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think it was Jaspers, the German philosopher Jaspers, who had first noticed that it's in a relatively brief period of time, from about 800 to 200 BCE, that in many different civilizations, you have these big systems telling us how we ought to live our lives, what the goal of life ought to be, what is it to live the well-lived life. These systems, these answers to this most basic of all existential questions, rising up, and these are all systems that remain with us to this day. I mean, there have been other systems that have fallen away, but you have the Abrahamic religion arising, and you have Confucianism and Taoism and Jainism and Hinduism and Buddhism, and in the Greek world, you have Greek philosophy and Greek tragedy, interestingly. And so there are various theses around. These were all well-fed areas. You didn't have to worry about surviving 24/7, so you could think about these larger questions. And I think that that is certainly a precondition, that there's a certain stability, and and you're not hunting and gathering all the time. The food source is reliable. And also, these were fairly developed civilizations. They had monetary systems, they had slavery, they had standing armies. So these were sort of established, a certain degree of stability. And I think given that stability, you start asking the big existential question, well, now that I don't have to think about survival all the time, what am I surviving for? What is this life really supposed to be about? And that Greek philosophy and Greek tragedy are a response to this same question that Hinduism and Buddhism and Confucianism and Abrahamic religion were also responses to. And what is so very interesting is they answer it in very, very secular terms. It was as I don't have to tell you, it was a culture that was saturated in religious rituals for everything. But they didn't bring their gods into
the Greeks.
The Greeks. They didn't bring their gods into their response to this most fundamental of existential questions. What do I do so that I don't waste my one chance here at life? And I talk about that Greek philosophy was sort of a response to an earlier Greek answer, sort of Homeric answer, the heroic answer, that in order to make sure that you are not just totally forgotten, so that it will be as if you've never lived at all, you have to do something that will get you attention. Your name will live on, kleos, acclaim, glory, fame, and the poetry that sings of it. And that was the general Greek culture. And Socrates and Plato and Aristotle are both a product of it, but also are somewhat challenging of it, are disapproving of certain aspects of it.
So just to clarify a few points for our listeners. So we have this general trend across Eurasia in these same latitudes, basically.
Yes.
People have a lot of food. They have much more organized societies. They're consuming, I think you point out in your book, they're consuming a lot more calories,
yes,
more energy. And so the will to survive changes to the will to matter, the will to actually have a meaningful life, right?
Yes, yes.
And the Greek response is originally, well, just be like totally awesome in war.
Yes, war or something, be beautiful, be incredibly beautiful, be rich, be a wonderful poet, an athlete, something, something usually manly, right? Yes.
And then Socrates will challenge that, but before we get there, the first wave of philosophy that emerges in this early axial age is in Ionia, the western coast of what is now Turkey. And you talk about the Ionian enchantment or the Ionian intuition about
Yes.
science or proto-science. So what do they do there that's so important?
Yeah, so it's my good friend Gerald Holton at Harvard, who's a historian of science and a great expert on Isaac Newton, who had coined this term, the Ionian Enchantment. I somewhat don't like the word enchantment because it sounds as if it's not true, that it's a kind of illusion. And I actually think it was intuition. It was a damn good intuition that the Ionians had, which was that there are forces in nature, that it's not the gods who are behind the changes and from day to night and from spring to fall and winter and summer, that there are these patterns and that they are few, that there are a few principles that could generate the vast details of nature, and that there was a simplicity behind the manifold of changes, and that they set out to try to discover what it was. And the leap to ask this kind of question, what is the sameness that is always the same through all of the changes, and what are the principles that govern the changes? I mean, to ask this kind of question was an incredible leap in intellectual and philosophical and scientific understanding, because that's what science has continued to always be about, to try to reduce the great complexity to simplicity. So they were amazing.
And these intuitions that nature has laws that are not divine, that they're natural laws that we can identify, and they're simple, and there's some basic principles behind everything, these are still intuitions held by modern scientists, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's always, if you've got, two or more theories that do justice to all the empirical data, go with the simple one, right? Go with the more elegant, simple one. So yeah, it's still a working principle, but it was an intuition that those Ionians came to. Yeah.
So if we fast forward now to Socrates 100 years later, he has available to him all these radical new ways of thinking, like the secular rationalism of the Ionians and these intuitions about reality. But he seems to say, stop thinking about the cosmos and the universe, and focus your attention on the human. The human is what we should be applying all these tools to, not the stars, right? So is that an important shift?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that, Plato is going to bring it all together again, and that he will eventually say that by understanding the stars and their beautiful mathematical order, it's replicated in our own souls, and that's how we can achieve the right balance that is justice and virtue. So he's going to, in some sense, go back certainly to the Pythagoreans and, in some sense to the Ionians, and bring it to bear on Socrates' question. But for Socrates, it seems, because these are all from the early dialogues that we get this, he was primarily concerned with the question of how we ought to live our lives, which I take to be the fundamental existential question that created what Jaspers had called the axial age.
So when he told his fellow Athenians that the unexamined life is not worth living,
Yes.
What is he telling them? I mean, what is the unexamined life and what's the examined life?
Yeah. So what he was saying was, when it comes to these normative questions, you have to question them for yourselves and be able to establish them. And so the unexamined life is you're living your life according to just the accepted opinions of your society, and which may have gotten it right, but may not have gotten it right. Every person has to, it's incumbent on everybody to try to account for these beliefs for themselves in company with others. And that's what philosophy is. That's exactly what the discipline of philosophy is.
So you actually said something in another podcast that struck me. You said that our society is so similar to Athens in certain ways that we're like in a unique position to understand them. Am I getting that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, this really has struck me because I think our society, I mean, it is in some sense a religious society. Well, so was Greek society. In some sense, it was a very religious society. But when it comes to the existential questions, like the ones that keep you up at night, right? You know, someday I'm going to die, and it will have been as if I've never lived. What's it all for? Less and less we turn to the religious answer. Well, you know, God created me, there must be a reason, and, you know, as long as I live according to the way he wants me to live, I'm doing okay, and that's you know, and to the extent that being satisfied with the ready-made religious answers is waning, we are returning more and more to pre-Socratic Greece. What we want is attention, right? We want acclaim. And we don't even have to do anything very extraordinary to get it, right? We can have our Twitter accounts, and we have our Facebooks, and, you know, everybody's taking the Instagram and all that. You know, it's just, look at me. Prove to me that I exist, you know, that I am being replicated in your mind, being replicated in other minds, before we just cared about being replicated in God's mind. And so, you know, it's not that I'm preaching for a return to religion, quite the contrary, but I'm saying that we're sort of falling into the kind of answer that the ancient Greeks had given, and which I think prompted the Socratic rebellion against that answer, saying, no, you can get all the attention you want if you're not living your life virtuously or wisely. Don't count at all, doesn't count for nothing. If you get attention for the wrong things, you haven't achieved a thing. And to me, that's a message that could perhaps be sounded more loudly today. I think it's a good time for philosophy.
But if somebody sounded that message today, would they provoke the same rage that Socrates provoked?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we're sort of more tolerant, and I mean, they might be laughed at as a naive, you know, idiot. And
so why is it that when Socrates said that, he caused so much consternation?
Yeah, I think it was. And of course, Socrates was tolerated, and people even found him quite amusing for most of his long life. He was just another wonderful, flamboyant Athenian character. They took great pride in their being memorable creatures, and he certainly was a memorable creature. I think it was the particular moment in time that they had been defeated by the Spartans, by those Spartans who didn't have this great culture. It was strictly militaristic culture. So here was this philosopher telling them, oh, you think you're so great because you're Athenians, you have this Athenian exceptionalism, you know, no, you haven't really achieved anything. And then, you know, that was one thing for him to be saying that during the age of Pericles, at the height of their empire, after an ignominious defeat. They didn't need somebody like Socrates telling them that they were a bunch of losers. And so I think the timing of the trial in 399 BCE, they lost the war in 404 BCE, I think that says a lot.
So the Athenians were already wounded, and then Socrates was like salt on the wound.
I think that that's true. I mean, there are other reasons people bring in, of course, and you know, the fact that Alcibiades had betrayed Athens, and Alcibiades had been Socrates' student, and others who had been Socrates' young men, had been part of the oligarchy that had been put in place after the Athenians lost the war, that was put in place by the Spartans. And it was a bad oligarchy. It descended into, you know, all sorts of nefarious tactics and secret spies and executions. And it was bad. So there was also that.
So Socrates was friends with the wrong people.
Yeah, he was. He was friends with the wrong people. And I'll tell you, when I had this idea that maybe that's why Socrates was put to death. But when I finished the book, my husband and I went to Greece to celebrate, and Greece is my favorite place, and I never tire of going to Greece. And I was standing in the old agora, where the agora was, and looking up at the Acropolis, which is, of course, just a shadow of the glory. It was still pretty damn glorious, right? It still takes your breath away. But, compared to what it had been, when Socrates was looking up at it, and I just got overwhelmed with this sense of what audacity this man had. The Yiddish word chutzpah just keeps it right. This man really, Socrates had chutzpah. He is looking up. He's in the shadow of the Acropolis, that magnificent symbol of Athenian imperialism. And he's saying, you guys are nothing. You haven't even begun. And it's a democracy. They're all participating in this society. Pericles makes it very clear that they're all to participate. Spread around the extraordinariness. He makes it so clear in the funeral oration. You are all worthy. Your name will live on forever because you have been citizens of this incomparable civilization. And he's taken them all on, and in a very sensitive spot, in a spot that we all feel. None of us want to feel like we're nothing. And that's what he was telling them that they were nothing.
Wow. And of course, we have Socrates as described by Plato, and Plato, being a harsh critic of democracy, might have made Socrates' words especially powerful and harsh.
Yes, right? yes. And that's why your first, I would love to go back and speak to the real Socrates and find out how much of Plato's views were his and how many, and which wasn't. But yeah.
So Plato's Socrates, the one that we get in the dialogues, he's walking around Athens like every day, and he meets interesting people. And he asks them questions that they probably wouldn't really understand. Like they'll say, oh, I just met my good friend today. He's like, oh, but what is friendship? They're like, well, friendship is like me and my friend having a good time. He's like, no, not your friendship. What is friendship itself?
Yes,
right. And in all these questions where he leads people in these conversations by questioning them about some concept like justice or friendship or truth or beauty, all he does is ask questions, right? But there's an implication that somehow that can lead them to find the answer. So how is that supposed to work?
How is that supposed to work? And in the early dialogues, it never does. It always ends in aporia.
Which is?
No end, right? Yes, a dead end, really. No resolution. In the middle, in the later dialogues, and we assume that's when Plato is moving away from the historical Socrates, we do get answers. We get lots of answers, and we get answers, and then we get dialogues that take back those answers. So it's an ongoing questioning process. But what there is the firm belief in questioning always, and you see it throughout Plato's long life because he's always changing his mind about things. I mean, what he's realized very early on is that, the answers that feel the best to us, that please us the most, ought to be subject to particular scrutiny. And the ones whose genesis we can easily understand because they were given to us, ready-made by our society, are the ones that we ought to particularly scrutinize. And so, that's how the process is supposed to keep working. And that, ideally, you bring as many people with as many different intuitions into the conversation so you can see what is purely subjective and what has some sort of objectivity, some sort of claim to objective truth.
Interesting. So if you question various people and get the same result, then that means that that's the objective truth.
Yeah, but maybe if you're getting the same result in Athens, you better hightail it over to China or Egypt or, Sicily, that there is, or even Sparta. Of course, the wonderful thing about ancient Greece also was that you had these very different cultures in these different city-states, so a Sparta and an Athens and a Corinth would probably give very, very different answers to what is it that makes life worth living.
Because one of the criticisms of the Socratic method that Plato himself, Plato, a self-critic, right? In the Republic, he has one of the characters tell Socrates, look, Socrates, I can answer all your questions, but each step of the way you lead me a little bit astray, and then after 20 questions, you have me wherever you want. But that doesn't mean that that's the truth. It just means that you skillfully led me there.
Yeah, yeah. Isn't that wonderful that he's so honest about that? And he is, again, he's pointing out the flaws in that we are unaware of in the approach, and so to trying to get us to refine the approach. But philosophy is still this endless questioning, and that's its MO. Does it lead to anything? I think it actually does. I think it does, yeah.
Well, ideally it leads to the forms, and it would take a whole series of podcasts to properly address the theory of the forms,
yes.
But we should at least mention him.
Yes.
And I guess one of the main misconceptions that I had, and most people have when they first hear about them, is that they think that this is some kind of like heaven where you have these perfect forms and that our world is an imperfect reflection of that. But that's not really what he's saying, is it?
No.
So, I mean, is there a way that you could distill like the main point he's making about reality and our access to...
Yeah, I mean that our particular world is a realization of these abstractions which do exist, and these abstractions are the object of our knowledge, right? That everything I can say, so they're the object of our descriptions, they're the object of our, for the most part, the object of our knowledge. Just about anything I can say about any particular is going to be in terms of these forms, so that the carriers of meaning and of knowledge is primarily abstractions. Now that's still a viable claim.
And there are still mathematicians and scientists that claim to be Platonists, right?
Yeah.
So what does that mean if like a mathematician says that he or she is a Platonist?
Yes, and in fact, according to the American Mathematical Association's last poll, something like 95% of mathematicians characterize themselves as Platonists. They don't think that they're creating mathematics. They think they're discovering mathematics. That's really all it comes, down to. It's not that they're just making up some rules and seeing what the implications of their rules are. They are discovering objective truths about abstract entities like numbers and sets and various structures and topological structures. And that's what Platonism and mathematics is.
In your book, when you talk about the forms, there was this line that I thought was very simple and illuminating. You said that the Platonist view is basically that reality is out there, and it's the same for everyone, right?
Yes. I think that's really one of the most important things about Plato, right? that reality is out there. It's the same for all of us, to the extent that we fill our minds with the way reality is. Our minds will be very similar, and that will be good for human relations, right? So it's kind of even a promise of more harmony between us if we really restrain ourselves, so that we only believe what we can really justify about reality. We're going to have very similar ideas. That is, I think that was Plato's optimism. I don't know that he's an optimist, but he was enough of an optimist to come back to Athens after Socrates was put to death and found the academy. And that's kind of optimism.
And if reality is out there, and we can all have access to it, then potentially all our Socratic dialogues will lead to the truth.
Yeah, to the extent that there's no promise that reality is completely accessible to our feeble cognitive powers. Mm-hmm. So, and we tend to fill in the gaps, where we're getting good, well-grounded answers, but there's still a lot left over. We don't like to just say, well, let's leave that blank, we don't know. We tend to fill in the blanks, and that's where our own temperaments and histories and biases, have a field day. So, but the great rationalist hope from maybe Parmenides, certainly to Plato, through Spinoza, and into our own day, the great rationalist's hope is that to the extent that we restrain ourselves and are very, very careful about what we believe about reality, we'll believe similarly and stop causing so much unnecessary grief for one another over what we disagree about. And it all goes back to the Greeks. It really does.
So you have Plato meet various interesting people, like a neuroscientist, a TV personality, an advice columnist, and a Google employee, and so forth.
And a tiger mom.
A tiger, yes.
Yes.
But one conspicuously absent encounter was a modern philosophy department.
Oh, yeah.
And I was wondering if let's just stick to Plato's Socrates, since we have that character vivid.
Yeah.
If that questioning, annoying, relentless Socrates of Plato were to show up in a philosophy department today,
Yes.
how would he be received?
Very well.
Really?
He's always there. He's always there. I go to, philosophy talk after philosophy talk, and the unceasing questioning that goes on is, it's sometimes about such small things, and you think, oh my God, this is so boring. Can we just move on? But it's also a testament to something or other. Really caring about the truth, right? Mm-hmm. And I, particularly right now at this present moment when, the notion of truth is under such attack, I actually am finding the endless questioning that can go on in a philosophy seminar, ad nauseum, inspiring and wonderful. I have more patience for it now than I ever did.
Every reader of Platonic dialogues is always asking, is this Socrates or is this Plato? And
yeah.
I can imagine listeners now hearing us and saying, you guys keep talking about Socrates and then Plato and then Socrates, like, where does one end and the other begin?
Yeah.
And you are in a unique position of having actually written Socratic dialogues featuring Plato. So where do you think the historical Socrates starts and ends, and has writing these dialogues affected your opinion about that?
Yeah, has it affected my opinion about it? What became really clear to me when I was writing them was that I knew something more about Plato than I did about Socrates. That Plato really loved Socrates. He, as I was writing and trying to bring in as much of the real Plato as possible, you want to do justice to the real person as much as possible. So whenever I can, I'm quoting him, the real Plato, who's maybe quoting the real Socrates. You want to bring in as much as you possibly can, but you also want to carry him along in your own philosophical development. Certainly Plato wanted to carry Socrates along in his own philosophical development. Plato is a great, great philosopher. And he comes up with so many new ideas, and I think he carves out new areas of philosophy that Socrates hadn't really recognized. And he brings that, as we said, the Pythagorean love of abstraction back to the ethical question. And so he's so assimilating. He's going beyond Socrates. But I do believe that we should be generous in trying to see the real Socrates in the dialogues as much as we can, as much as is consistent with Plato carrying him on in his own philosophical development, because I feel like Plato loved Socrates, and so that he wanted to get as much of the real man and the real words of the man into his dialogues as he could. So I actually go further in interpreting the real Socrates in these dialogues than I did before I began the project.
And if you could meet Socrates and ask him one question, what would it be?
Do you think that Plato was right to take philosophy out of the agora and put it into the academy? Do you think that your disciple, Plato, made a mistake in making professional philosophers and taking it away from all of us?
Rebecca Goldstein, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you. It's really been a pleasure.
Next time, we'll take a look at the incredible technological advances that happened in the centuries after Plato. In the meantime, if you'd like to learn more about Plato or philosophy in general, check out the book, Plato at the Googleplex, Why Philosophy Won't Go Away. Also, if you want to help spread the word about the podcast, please leave us a review on iTunes. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @GreasePodcast to stay up to date on upcoming episodes and other news. And join us next time when we will investigate a mysterious ancient artifact that has been called the world's oldest computer. Thanks for listening to Ancient Greece, Declassified.
Can you still sing Orpheus? Then sing something that's going to last. 1,000 years slips by so fast, goes off into a dusty myth with you.